Hello, my quilty friends. It's Stacy of Stacy Creates Stuff, and today I am going to tell you all about my 2025 Sew-Along, Stars in the Garden. With the ho-hum of winter upon us and the gloomy, miserable days, one can only dream about spring. And so I designed this very bright and colorful, full of spring colors, quilt called Stars in My Garden. The way the Sew-Along works is that each week I will bring you a video tutorial on how to make that week's block. There are 12 weeks in the series. We won't exactly be making 12 different blocks, because some of the blocks are repeated, but just in a different colorway. Some weeks you'll make just one block. Well, only 1 week will you make one block, and that is week 1. After that, you will make anywhere from 4 to 8 blocks, all the same block in that color. And then another week you will make another block, sometimes 4, sometimes 8. In the end, you will have a lap-size quilt, but you can add borders to make it larger. And I will go over all those details when we finish up the quilt top. The pattern for this, well, it's not so much a pattern as it is a guide. So there is a guide that you can download off of my website just by joining my Stars in the Garden mailing list. If you love the colors that I have used for my quilt, good news, there are kits available from my favorite quilt shop, Vintage Pink and Green. There is a link in the description below that will take you to purchasing the kit. Now, the kit will include all the fabrics for the blocks. Borders, backing, binding are not included in the kit. If you choose to use your own stash, not a problem, and it's super simple. So let's talk about what you will need to make this quilt. I've tried to keep this as simple as possible as far as organizing your fabrics for the quilt. And you will need a total of 18 fabrics, 1/2 yard of each of those. Now, from some, once you've done the cutting, you'll have a little bit left over, and from some you'll have a little less left over. But that allows you to be able, in case you have a miscut or a mishap, to have a little extra fabric for that. I promise, though, that you will not have a ton of any particular fabric left over. I would call it a comfortable amount. I chose to use batiks for all of my fabrics, and here is what I used. 3 whites. Each of the whites that I used had a little bit of a light beige pattern on them, and I thought it was just enough to add a little pizzazz. 2 light pinks, 3 medium pinks, 2 dark pinks, 2 light greens, 2 medium to dark greens, 2 light blues, and 2 medium to dark blues. If you don't want to use those particular colors, feel free to instead use purples and yellows and greens, whatever suits your particular taste. Generally, you need 2 lights and 2 medium or darks, except for the pink, which required 2 light pinks, 3 medium, and 2 dark. So whichever fabric you want to use, where I have pink, just make sure you have essentially 3 shades of that. Once you download the guide, use it to cut the pieces that you need for each of the colors. So the first white, the second white, the third white, and so forth. You can use the sheet that's included in the guide and cut apart the block numbers so that you can better organize your fabric. I found it easiest that once I cut one fabric, I went ahead and distributed those pieces into their little block baggies. There is a chart included in the guidebook that you can see what pieces go into which block. Once all of the fabric is cut, then I organized it into a bin putting the blocks in order so that I was ready to sew. This sew-along is structured so that you don't necessarily have to start at any particular time. You just go ahead and start whenever you feel like it and work at your own pace, whether that is weekly keeping up with the blocks or taking and sewing everything together at a quilting retreat. Once the lessons are released on my YouTube channel and my website, they will stay up indefinitely. This is a beginner-friendly quilt. There are only 2 real things that you need to know, and you can learn them and master them with this quilt. One is half square triangles and the other is flying geese. And if you are a more experienced quilter, I think you will still find a lot of enjoyment in making these blocks. There's a few that I had never made before, and I have been quilting for decades. We are going to start out nice and easy with a Sawtooth Star block. This is our basic star block for this quilt, and we only have to make one. However, from here on out, we will be making anywhere from 4 to 8 blocks each week. They will all be the same block, all in the same fabric. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's go ahead and learn how to make that Sawtooth Star. Our first week is easy because block 1, we only have to make one. So I'm pulling my baggie of pieces from the bin, and we're going to go ahead and pull these out. It makes it so much easier to have everything already cut and sorted to be able to put your block together. So this is going to be the basic star. The 4.5-inch square will go in the center. The blue squares go in the corners. And you can see at this point that the square is, or the block is basically a 9 patch. There are 3 pieces here, here, and here. They'll get sewn together in rows. But in order to make it a star, we need some star points, and that is going to be formed with flying geese, which we will be using these pink squares, the medium pink, to sew onto the rectangles. And the way that works is we will place a square on one side of the rectangle, sew right on the diagonal, and of course we can draw that diagonal. And then once that is sewn, this will peel back, and we will do the same to the other side. Draw and then sew on that diagonal. That's from corner to corner. And when that comes back, that will form our flying geese. And we will do that for each of the rectangles, and then we'll be ready to sew our block together. So let's go ahead and mark for our diagonals. I'm using the sandpaper board to hold down my square. I have a single square here on the board. And I'm just going to take a ruler, lay it from corner to corner. Of course, you can use a much smaller ruler. This one was handy. And I'm going to draw my line right on the diagonal. Now, it might be a little hard to see on camera, but I'll be able to see it clearly at my sewing machine. And I'm going to go ahead and mark all of my squares and get sewing. All right, here we are with the first square sewn in. I have sewn on this diagonal and pressed that back, so I get the first triangle of my flying geese. And of course, once you do that, then you can cut off the excess. Now, these can become half square triangles for a different project. And if you want to save yourself a little time and energy, I do save a bunch of these just like this in order to use as leaders and enders. So the thing to little thing to sew to get me going before I start sewing something else so that my thread doesn't pull through and do weird things to the back of my work. But you can also go ahead and sew an extra line, essentially sewing this seam here that allows this little half square triangle to form. So this line here is on the actual diagonal. It's not like a half square triangle, which we'll be doing in the future blocks. Again, right on the diagonal. And then this one is just in that space where this extra bit is coming. So I've sewn a line, and now I will be able to cut these apart. Honestly, I usually cut them with scissors because it's just as easy. And I left more than 1/4 of an inch, but not a 1/2 an inch. I'm going to try to get as much real estate out of this half square triangle as possible. So this does not have to be 1/4 of an inch because we've already sewn that seam down. So those are all of my, well, there's one more. It's still on the machine. And these I just toss into a bin, save them for later. I might press it, I might not. And then if I haven't sewn it, I can save these for that leader ender thing. Now the next step will be to, again, having marked all of my squares, I will place that on there and then sew on this diagonal. And then the same process, I will press that back, trim off the excess, or sew an extra little seam there so that I already have it ready for a half square triangle. These will not be used in this quilt, but perhaps I can come up with a leftover bits project. We shall see. Anyhow, I'm going to go ahead and finish out these 4 flying geese, and then we will put them back into our block. All right, and now that I have my finished flying geese, I can go ahead and place those right on my design board and start sewing this block together. So 1 row, 2nd row, 3rd row, and we'll sew all the rows together to form the block. And here we have our finished block. It is the center block. There is only one. This will be the only week where there is 1 block to complete. From here on out, you might have 4, you might have 8, but never more than 8 blocks. And they will all be the same block for that particular week. I'm going to go ahead and put this on my design wall right in the center, and I'll be back next week to show you block number 2. This week's blocks use the same techniques that we used in the first block, which was a Sawtooth Star. In that block, we had squares and flying geese. This block, it's all about the flying geese with a couple of rectangles to square it off. We'll be making a total of 4 of these blocks, and they will start radiating from that center block we made last week. Let's get started on how to put this block together. This week, we're ready for block number 2. This is a flying geese block, and we will be making 4 of them. I'm going to gather out my components. All 4 blocks are exactly the same. We have side rails. So I'll put 4 on each side. And then we have 4 flying geese that go down the center of this block. Now, of course, that seems to be taking up a lot more space than it needs to, but by the time these are all sewn together, they will be the same height as these side rails. Now, just like last week's star block, we have squares that will go in the corners. Now, of course, the great thing about batiks is that both sides of the fabric are the same, so it doesn't really matter. I'm going to go ahead and put my square down. I will draw my diagonal, sew along that diagonal, turn that back, and do the same for the other side. That will make my flying geese, and I will have 4 of those stacked upon each other. So I'm going to go ahead and start with making a lot of flying geese. 16 to be exact. And that will be enough for all 4 blocks. So here are my 4 flying geese. I'm going to go ahead and sew these all together to form a column, and then we'll sew the side columns on, and we'll have a completed block. Here is the column of geese all sewn together. Now let's put on those sidebars. And here we have block number 2 completed. You'll be making a total of 4 of these blocks, and they will be surrounding the block that we made last week. This week we are making the Road to Oklahoma block. It's a fun one to do, and it just involves squares and some half-square triangles. In this video, I will be showing you how to do half-square triangles, but if you want more information, I recorded a whole tutorial on half-square triangles and flying geese units that's available on my channel. There'll be a link in the description below. Let's get started. All right, let's take a look at block number 3. This block is made up of squares and half-square triangles. In this kit, we have 2.5-inch squares in green, medium pink, dark pink, and light pink. And then we also have 3-inch squares in the light pink and the dark pink. And these we're going to turn into half-square triangles. So, of course, how do you make a half-square triangle? If you already know, you can skip ahead to the part where we start laying out the block. But if half-square triangles are new to you, I'm just going to grab my sandpaper board, and I'm going to take the lightest square because that's easier to see, and I'm just going to use my quick quarter, and I am putting the center part of that on the point of the block, and then I'm just going to draw on each side of my little tool here. And there are my 2 sewing lines. So I'm going to mark each one of those. If you don't have a quick quarter type of guide, you can certainly do this with a regular ruler, a regular quilting ruler. And to do that, you can draw a line down the center. And then you're just going to go over 1/4 of an inch on each side of that. So I'm going to make this line a little bit darker than the very light one that I drew down the center, because I'm not sewing on the dead center. I'm sewing on each side. There we go. So there you can see that as well. So I'm going to mark all of the light pink ones and pair those up with the dark pink. I'll sew just inside this line. I'm going to sew towards closer to the center part as opposed to over that way towards the point. That just gives me a little extra leeway for when I go to trim this down and get a 2.5-inch little block out of that. So you get 2 half-square triangles out of each pair of light and dark. All right, let's go sew those, and I'll check right back with you. And now I have all of the half-square triangles cut and pressed. So there would have been 2 together. Cut them apart, press open, but now I need to trim them. All right, I like to use my little rotating mat. It is not necessary. You can certainly do it on a non-rotating mat, and you'll just have to move your pieces. And I'm also using a bias square ruler, but you can also use a regular ruler, and I will show you that in just a moment. These need to finish at 2.5, so I am going to place the diagonal on the diagonal of my block, and I'm just making sure that the edges of my square are going past the 2.5-inch mark. And I'll make the first cuts. And then I'm going to come through here, and now to make the second set of cuts, again lining on the up on the diagonal, and then also making sure that I'm on the 2.5 inches marks on that. There we have our perfect half square triangle. So it measures the same size as our 2.5-inch squares. Now, if you don't have a bias square ruler, it's quite all right. You can use your regular cutting ruler. This is a 12-inch one just for ease of moving around, but you can certainly do it with the 24-inch one as well. There is a 45-degree angle on the ruler, and you're going to place that 45-degree angle on the diagonal of the block. And again, I'm making sure that 2.5 inches is this mark here, and I do have fabric beyond that. So I trim that off. And I'm going to, again, place, there are two 45, so I don't have to rotate my ruler around. And I'm placing that on the diagonal, and again, making sure that there is more than the width in the 2.5. I'm just trying to trim off the least amount on these first cuts. All right, so I've trimmed those two. Going back up to this line, and now I need to make sure that I am at the 2.5-inch mark. And then for this last side, there's my 45-degree angle and 2.5. And another perfect half square triangle. So you can see that you can use any ruler that has a 45-degree angle on it. It does make it a little easier with the bias square ruler because I can easily cut two sides before I have to rotate either the mat or the square. All right, let's get all those cut, and then we will lay out the block. All right, now that we have our half square triangles, let's go ahead and lay out our block. So there's a nice center diagonal of green squares. We have some dark pink ones. Medium pink in the opposite corners. Light pink down there, and then our half square triangles make a sort of little tulip shape here with the light pink, and we get our lovely block. Now this is a 16 patch. There are 4 rows, each with 4 little squares in them, so I will sew each as a row and then sew the rows together, and that will make the block. Now that we've made these blocks, well, we have a little mini quilt, to be honest, and you could stop right here, sew it all together, and call it a day. But of course, we have 9 more weeks filled with blocks that will make us a large lap size quilt. And with some borders, we can even extend that to become a twin size. This week's block is a variation of the very first block we did, which was the Sawtooth Star. So this is almost like that, except we have half square triangles in the corner. This week you will be making 8 of these star variations, and they will start the next layer coming out from the center of our quilt. Let's take a look at block number 4. This is another star block. So we have our large center portion there. We have some rectangles, which are going to go with these white squares to make Flying Geese units. And then we have the light pink and medium blue 3-inch squares that are going to make half square triangles. And these are going to go into the corners of each block. In our previous blocks, we have learned to make Flying Geese units, and we have also learned how to make half square triangles. So let's sew these components together, and then I'll show you how to assemble the block. Here is the layout of the block once we have the Flying Geese and the half square triangle units sewn together. I'm going to sew 3 rows, the top, middle, and bottom row. Sew those units together to form a row, and then I will sew the rows together to finish the block. And again, we need 8 of these for our quilt. And there you have it, my friends, the finished block. I hope that you had as much fun making this as I did. I love that we now have some green coming out from continuing the greens that we had in our last block. And of course, we continue with the pink and the blue. We are on week 5 of the Stars in My Garden Sew-Along quilt. We will be making 8 of these blocks, and to give ourselves a little reprieve from half square triangles and flying geese, we have a block that is mostly squares. Now I know what you're about to say, angles, but I have a simple, fast, easy way to make this block with no triangles involved. Let's get started. And now we are ready for block number 5. So let's look and see what's in this package. We have some 4.5-inch green squares, a whole lot of dark pink, some medium pink, and some green squares. This is a relatively simple block. We'll be taking the center green square, and we will be using the dark pink and putting one of these in each corner, sewing on the diagonal and popping that back. And we'll be doing the same for these other 2 corners, and that'll be the center of our block, and then these other squares will go around it to make a fun little pattern with this block. So what do we need to do? Mark on the diagonal of the dark pink square. So I'm just going to show you here. I'm using my sandpaper board. I have 1 square down there. Just going to go ahead and mark. And I'll repeat that for the others. And then again, I'll just know where to sew. And I'll be trimming off the excess. And of course, you can go ahead and sew about 1/2 inch away to have some half square triangles for a future project. Let's go ahead and stitch one of these up so you can see how it works. I like to sew 2 opposite corners first, and then after I have trimmed that away and pressed that back, I have this going on, and then I am ready to go ahead and sew the other 2 corners. Let's do that. You want to make sure that you trim off the excess before you sew on the last 2 dark pink squares. It'll just make your trimming a whole lot easier. Now that we have that center sewn, let's go ahead and lay out the rest of the block. So our corners are going to get the green squares. Our pieced unit there goes in the center. Then the dark pink goes 1 at the top, 1 on the side, 1 at the bottom opposite, and on the side opposite. And then the medium pink go in between, and that lays out our block. Now, this goes together a little differently because of this being 1 single piece. We need to sew these 2 together on the sides, and we need to then sew this as a row and the bottom one as a row. And then before we sew these rows together, of course, we need to sew these little wings to the center so that this becomes a complete row. And then we will sew all of the rows together to make our block. And we will make a total of 8 of these blocks. And here is our finished block. Remember, you need to make 8 of these in total, and they will all be exactly the same. So what did you think, my quilty friends? Pretty easy, wouldn't you say? And a very effective block. I really like how this one goes. And now that we can add that block in, well, we have finished another ring of our quilt working outward. And yes, you could stop here and have yourself a mini quilt. Not as mini as a couple of weeks ago, but a quilt nonetheless. Still at this point, it is square, and eventually it will be rectangular, but you have to stay for a few more weeks to find out how we do that. And we are back with week 6 of the Stars in My Garden Quilt-Along. This week we are revisiting a block that we've already done, but we are using different fabrics. So it is another Flying Geese block. And this time we have dark blue geese with a dark pink background and medium green side rails. I love it, and it's going to bring out a lot of color to the next ring of our quilt. This week we are ready for block 6. And the good news is you've already made this block in different colors. This is another Flying Geese block where we have green sides this time. And our geese are blue. There'll be 4 of those going up with pink triangles on the sides. So this is made just like all the other Flying Geese that we have done. All right, now that I have the Flying Geese units made, we're going to go ahead and lay out the block. It is the same as last time. We have our 2 side pieces, and then we just stack our Flying Geese right on top of each other, and they serve as the center portion. And once this whole unit is sewn together, then I sew the sides on, and you end up with this. And there we have it. You'll make a total of 8 of this particular Flying Geese block. And then next week, we'll be ready for the next block. This week's block, it's a star block. And, well, it has a little interest in the points there. So it's your basic Sawtooth Star, but we're going to do something interesting with the points. Now, don't panic. I promise it's going to be easy, and it actually combines 2 techniques that we've done before. Flying Geese, of course, and half square triangles. You will be making a total of 4 of these blocks that we will add to our ever-growing quilt. So, let's get to it. This week we are working on block number 7, and this is a star block, all in pinks. And some white. We have light pink 2.5-inch squares. We have white and dark pink 3-inch squares. We have some medium pink 4.5-inch squares that'll be in the center. And we have some light pink rectangles that will be for the edges. The first thing that you'll need to do is to take your 3-inch white and dark pink, and you are going to pair those together and make half square triangles. All right, once you have a stack of half square units, you are going to use these and make flying geese. And that is the way that you make that special little teeny tiny triangles that happen in the corner. So it might take a little bit playing around with. I'm going to go ahead and place. This definitely has a right side because the other side has the seam showing. And I am going to sew actually on the diagonal, not on either side, just right on that diagonal that goes from corner to corner. And when I pull that back, then I will get the first part of my flying geese. And then I'm going to take the next one, and again, going from corner to corner on the diagonal, making sure that it's right sides together. It doesn't really matter for the rectangular piece because it's batik. Both sides are okay. And then when I pull that back, I will get this. You want to make sure that the white parts of that half square triangle unit are near the top point of your Flying Geese unit. So that's what it will look like. All right, let's go make those so we can lay out this block. All right, let's lay out block 7. We start with our 4.5-inch square in the center. That's in our medium pink. And then we're going to have our star points. So it's a little confusing to figure out what's the point here because we've got the Flying Geese. So the trick is that the Flying Geese unit, this larger triangle, points inward. So we'll put all of those right in that way. Now the star is starting to show up a little better. And then in the corners, we have our 2.5-inch light pink squares. This goes together like all of our star blocks. It is basically a 9 patch. There are 3 rows, our top row, our middle row, and our bottom row. And each of the rows is made up of 3 pieces. So we'll sew those 3 pieces together for each row, and then the rows together to make our final block. And here is the finished block. It is so cute. I really like it. I can picture an entire quilt with this block, maybe some sashing. Well, that's a project for another day. So again, you need to make a total of 4 of these, and we will add those to our quilt. I hope the instructions today are giving you confidence to give this block a try. Even if you're not doing the quilt-along, you could make this block. It's a lot of fun. I found it to be way more enjoyable than I thought when I originally designed the quilt. And a little sad there's only 4 of these in the quilt, but that's okay. Maybe there'll be a future quilt with more. You've heard of square in a square blocks? Well, today we're going to make a star in a star. But I am super excited about today's block because it's a star in a star. So we've already made some Sawtooth Stars, just a basic one we did last week where we had some special points. That was a lot of fun. And I have to say that I enjoyed making this block more than I thought I would. I mean, the block is beautiful and that was exciting, but to actually make it, it was easier than I thought. So let's get right to it. Let's take a look at the pieces we have for block 8. So from our light blue, we have some rectangles and some squares. From our dark pink, we have some 2.5-inch squares, some very small squares and small rectangles. And then in white, we have more small squares and more 2.5-inch squares. So this is going to be a star inside of a star. So if we take a look at our hot pink or dark pink and our white, we are going to make little tiny flying geese. By now, of course, you are an expert at making flying geese. So we'll be using the 2 small white squares, and that is going to form a star point. And we'll have star points all the way around. And then we'll be using the small squares. These are 1.5-inch squares. And they will go like this. And this is sewn together just like we would any other star block, except it's just smaller. But it is 3 rows of 3 units. So it's a basic 9 patch. We will sew those each row together and then sew all of that together. And that gets us this, which should finish at 4.5 inches. And then you can just treat this like the big center of a regular star block, the original one that we made. And we'll be putting our Flying Geese units, which are made with our blue rectangles and our dark pink squares. Those will go on each edge, and then in the corners goes our blue. And there you have a star inside a star. All the construction you are familiar with. We have our little Flying Geese units. We have larger Flying Geese units. And then we're just sewing our stars together. And here is the finished block. I love it. It's so cool with the star inside the star. You're going to make a total of 4 of these. And I hope you like it, because next week we're making some more in different colors. I hope you found that this is not going to be as challenging of a block as you might have thought just initially looking at it. If you can make a Sawtooth Star, which if you've done the very first block of this sew along, you made a Sawtooth Star. All we're doing is making 2 of those. And one is tiny and it fits inside as the center of the big star. So you can do it. It's Flying Geese. That's it. And some squares. This week, same block, different color. It really is a fun block to make. And so I will, once again, give you a quick tutorial on how to put it together. But it is basically just a Sawtooth Star inside a Sawtooth Star. So if you already did last week's block and you're feeling confident, just check that guide for what pieces you need exactly, or check on my website where I have a blog post that details exactly how to put this block together. So here is the quick little recap of how it goes together. Here is block 9. This bag has a lot of pieces in it. That is because we are going to be making 8 of this block. And this block is the same as block 8, just in different colors. So we have lots of tiny squares in our dark green or medium green and white. We have some rectangles in white. These pieces will go to make that center small star. And then, along with these green centers. And then we have blue and white for the outer part of the star. So if you watched last week's video, you already know how this goes together. And if you didn't, it's okay. I'm going to show you how. Here we are with our pieces ready to lay out our block. So let's start with that center square. We have our very center in green, and it's a green star. So we'll put all of our little points around that way. And then, of course, to fill in, I realize this is white fabric on the white background, but that's how it is. And of course, this is like a little mini block in and of itself. You have to put this block together before you can continue. It's 3 rows of 3 pieces that get all sewn together to form that. So there's our mini star, and from there we are ready to add the outer pieces. So this larger star is a white star, so we'll be putting these pieces all the way around, and then our blue in the corners. And again, it goes together just like all of our star blocks, 3 rows with 3 pieces each. Yes, this counts as 1 unit. And when you sew all those together, you get your finished block. So this is just like block 8, but in different colors, and you will be making a total of 8 of these blocks. Next week, we have another star block, and well, I'm not going to tell you too much about it. So This week we are returning to the very basis of this quilt, which is the Sawtooth Star. So many of the star blocks in this quilt are based off of a Sawtooth Star, and we've only made one actual Sawtooth Star, and that was the very first block, and we only made one. But this week we are making a different colorway, and we are going to make 8 of these very pretty pink stars on a green background. So if you need a refresher for how these go together, I'm going to walk you through the process. All right, let's get sewing. And we're ready for block 10. So this block is a throwback to the very first block we did. It is the basic star, just in different colors. So we have some lovely light pink centers. We will have green for our flying geese along with the pink, and then green corners. All right, so let's lay out our block. We have our light pink center. We have all of our flying geese star points. And then we have our medium green corners. This is a typical 9 patch like we've done before. We've done this star, we've done variations of this star, and of course you're going to sew 3 rows that have 3 units each. You sew those all together, and you get your finished square. So remember, we're going to be making 8 of these blocks, and we are almost there. There are only 2 more blocks left. And next week, a block we've never done before, and I think you're going to like it. This week, week 11, we have a whole new block for our sew-along. We're going to be making the Hovering Hawks block. So this block is just squares and half square triangles, and I know you know how to do those already, but I am going to walk you through, especially because we've never made this block before in this sew-along, and I think you're going to enjoy it. So let's get sewing. It's time for block 11. We are almost there, and you will only need to make 4 of these blocks. We have all squares, 2.5 inch and 3 inch. So our 3-inch squares are going to become half square triangle units, and they get paired up like this. We will have dark pink and light pink, and we will have medium blue and light green. And you will also be making light pink, light green units as well. So let's make those, and then I'll show you how to put this block together. All right, let's lay out block 11. We're going to start with our green squares in opposite corners. And then we have our dark pink, light pink half square triangles that are going to go to the sides of that. Then we have our medium blue, light green, and a blue square. Put the other blue square in the opposite corner there. That one goes there. Here are we have our medium pink, and that leaves us with our light green, light pink combination. So this is a 16 patch. There are 4 rows with 4 units in each row. That makes 16 pieces altogether. And we're simply going to sew these in rows. So we'll sew this row, 3rd row, and the 4th row, and then we will sew all the rows together. And we come out with this, our Hovering Hawks block. Now you only need to make 4 of these Hovering Hawk blocks, and we are almost done. Now after next week, when we finish our last block, then we are going to come back and I'm going to tell you all about borders if you choose to make some borders. This week's block is a favorite, I hope, that we have done a couple of times before. This is a whole new set of colors, and we only need to make 2. So, Flying Geese it is. Let's get sewing. Our final block, block 12. This is a Flying Geese block. We have already made 2 of these in different colors, and this one is the last one, and you only need to make 2. So we'll be using our light blue and medium pink to make our Flying Geese. We'll make 4 of those units. Sew those 4 units together and then sew on our sides. And those 2 blocks will complete our quilt top before borders. All right, here we are with our Flying Geese. And again, we're just going to take the 4 of them, stack them on top of each other, sew them together. And once those are together, we can sew on our side pieces. And that will give us our finished block. And again, with this, we make 2, and that will complete all the blocks we need for the quilt top before borders. My friends, thank you so much for joining me on this journey. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is not the end of this project, because I will be back next week to talk all about borders. You may be perfectly happy with your quilt as is, or you may feel it needs to add a little bit more, either to make it bigger or to sort of frame it. And we're going to talk all about that next week. But let's talk about borders, because that is our next step. I have sewn all my blocks together and they look like this. And I want to make my quilt a little bit bigger. So the quilt top without borders is about 56, I believe, by 72, which is a decent size in and of itself. You could leave it as is, or if you wanted to add just 1 border around, you could either do a 4-inch border or a 6-inch border, or any other border, to be perfectly honest. But I do have the fabric requirements for those 2 measurements in the handout. The requirements are also on my website on the blog post. All of that is linked in the description below. Now, adding 1 border will give it a nice frame, and I'm going to put a little mock-up of what that could look like. But I am opting for a double border. So I am going to put a thin strip of white tone-on-tone, very similar to the white tone-on-tones that I used in my quilt. It's from the same collection, although I don't think the exact same fabric that I used. And then I am going to place a 6-inch border on the outside. So this is a mock-up of what that will look like. So in order to prepare my bindings, I need to know how long to cut them. Now, of course, if everything was sewn perfectly together, I would know that I would need to cut those long side borders 72.5 inches. But, you know, the more blocks you have and the more pieces those blocks have, the more likely that there might be a little discrepancy between what actually measures and what is supposed to be the measurement. And that is why I use this method to figure out the length of each of my borders. I start by laying my quilt out on a flat surface, and I am going to measure down the center of the quilt and then down each side. Now I am putting the side borders on first, so I am measuring those lengths. I have written down each of those, and mine happened to be 72.25, and there was a little tiny shortage of fabric at that one spot, so it probably would have been 72.5, which would have been perfect. One edge was 72.5, and the other was 72.75. So I'm going to average all those together, and I'm going to go with 72.5. So, yay! I am cutting a total of 7 1.5-inch strips. That will make that finished 1-inch inner border, which I think is just enough to kind of give it a little frame before adding my outer border. It's not unusual when cutting especially skinny strips, but also wider strips, that you may have to re-square up your edge. Once all the strips are cut, I am going to join them together into one very long strip. That will just make it easier to cut the lengths that I need. I like to join my strips together with a miter join, but you can certainly just do a straight join as well. All right, here I have sewn together. There's a join there that you can see. And I have just doubled over my strip because I have to cut two that are exactly the same length. So I'm going to go ahead and just square off the end, because that is a selvage end right there. And then I'm going to measure my 72.5 inches, and I will cut that off. Now, part of this will be off camera because I have to use the edge of my mat, and my camera doesn't reach that far. Okay, it was 72 there. I want to add my 1/2 inch because I need it to be 72.5 inches. So I'm going to slice her right there. So this I will save for doing the top and bottom. And this nice length, I'm going to sew to the sides. Now, once those two borders are sewn into place, I lay my quilt out again. I have made sure that I have pressed it very well. I pressed it before I measured the first time. I'm making sure that those seams are pressed again for now that I've added those side borders. And I'm going to measure across the center of the quilt from side to side, and then across the top and across the bottom. And it is 58.5. Yay! Let's measure the top, which I know is out of camera, but that is measuring 58.75. And the last side was also 58.5. So two sides were 58.5. One was 58.75. I'm going to go ahead and cut my lengths at 58.5 because 2 of 3. I'm going with 2 out of 3. And 58.5 is ideally what it should be. So let's cut those and sew those on. All right, I'm back to cut my top and bottom strips at 58.5 inches, which is what it worked out for me. Now, when I went ahead and measured from the same edge that I had left off at, the 58.5 inches ended right where I had a seam. So I didn't cut there. What I did was I continued to find the center of the strip that was left, and I went ahead and just cut that. And now I'm going to measure from this end, which will hopefully not put me at an awkward seam. Who wants all that bulk right at a corner? Not I. All right. This is the mark where I actually need to cut it. Right there. Let me just make sure my strips are a little better aligned. There we go. All right, this is my leftover bit. Toss that aside. Now, before I take these over to my quilt, one of the things that I do besides making sure I know which is the right side up, I already had a rip out once on a side seam, and is to find the center point of the strip and then the quarter points. And what this allows me to do is, and I'm just going to kind of finger press where those are, is to align it with those points on the quilt. So I can find the halfway point across the top of the quilt and then a quarter of the way from there, or halfway from the half to the end. Does that make sense? Anyway, there's my halfway point. I finger pressed that. And now coming to this end, and I'm just going to do a little finger press there. Now, I will take these over to the machine, sew on these borders and press them. And guess what we get to do after that? Yes, it is measure all over again for our outer border. The outer borders are cut 6.5 inches. for a finished 6-inch border, and you will need 7 strips of these. And you would need this whether or not you have an inner border. If you skip the inner border, you still need 7 strips. And if you use the inner border, you also need 7 strips. If you are doing a smaller outer border, a 4.5 inch, that would be a cut 4.5 inch, finished 4 inch, then you also need 7 strips. The fabric requirements, as far as yardage is concerned, is available on my website on the blog post for this episode. Measuring for the outer border, 74.5. That's down the center, and I've already measured the sides, and they are the same. I added my outer borders the same way that I added the inner borders, with the side borders first and then the top and bottom border. And of course, when that was all done, I needed to pick out a backing, and I found a beautiful floral that was just perfect for the garden theme of the quilt. And it is a wide back, so I was very excited to use that because I didn't have to piece anything. I chose a quilt pattern called a Jasper on my Gamel. That is an edge-to-edge pattern, and it has a little bit of swirl and some circles and beautiful elements like that without being an actual floral design. And I just thought it turned out beautifully on the quilt. I chose one of the darker blue fabrics from my quilt to use as the binding. Now, there was not enough from my original kit to bind it, so I did go and get more of that fabric. And I did something that I don't usually do, which is I machine finished the binding. Of course, I usually attach the binding by machine, but then I finish it by hand. Well, I was putting the binding on yesterday, and I knew there was no way that I would be able to hand sew this binding on this twin-size quilt and get the video edited so that I could take final photos of it. But I think it turned out great, and there's nothing wrong with machine finishing your binding. I'm probably going to be doing it a little bit more often. Now, my finished quilt ends up being a twin size quilt, and if you need to make your quilt bigger, I have a couple suggestions for you. One, of course, is that you could keep adding some borders, but you know, it gets to a point, in my opinion, that how many borders can you have? Now, what you could do is, if you need to add more width and not necessarily much more length, then you could add 2 more columns of blocks, 1 on each side, to keep the symmetry of the quilt. And you can just repeat the blocks that are at the top and bottom of the quilt and add those to the side. You will then need to choose 4 new corner blocks, and they could be any of the blocks that we've already done, or make up a new one. A quilt like that with borders would look something like this. Now, that makes a square quilt and would come out to a small queen size quilt. I hope you enjoyed this series. I had a ton of fun putting this quilt together, making the blocks, laying them out, and even adding the borders. I loved how the quilting came out on it, and I love the backing. I'm thrilled with the entire thing. There are still kits available at Vintage Pink and Green, and the quilt will be hanging in the store throughout the spring and early summer. So if you happen to be in the Snow Hill, Maryland area, come on by Vintage Pink and Green and you can see the quilt. So I hope you will join me and subscribe to this channel, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.